This is the true Mirror's Edge experience. Mirror's Edge is an interesting game, to say the least. I've had my eye on this one for a few years, but I never got around to playing it until recently. And to be honest, when I finished the game and went to Metacritic to look up reviews about it, I was incredibly surprised. I just couldn't figure out what everyone else saw in this game that I didn't. In fact, I had a feeling it would be at least a bit underwhelming as soon as I started the tutorial. It's a slow and clunky introduction that doesn't really allow you to explore the parkour in full speed because every time you make one move, the game stops you dead in your tracks to spoon feed you the next instruction. Not to mention the game resets your position if you walk so much as 2 feet in the wrong direction. I was still optimistic to see the meat of the game though, so I pressed on. Okay, before I get too deep into the issues I have with this game, let's backtrack a little bit. The first thing anyone notices about this game is the art style. It was certainly an ambitious choice, but one I don't think entirely worked out. It does give the game a pretty cool atmosphere, and off the top of my head, I can't think of another game that attempts this kind of art style. It drives home the point this location isn't supposed to be a free city, but rather a heavily monitored state with individual freedoms being restricted. I mean, sucking the color out of everything will surely suck away the will of the people to fight back, right? At least, that's how it works if you're operating strictly through gaming logic. From an atmospheric standpoint, the art style works wonders. From a gameplay perspective, though, not so much. It gets pretty damn repetitive when you're running through levels and every single building interior and exterior looks almost identical. If you were to show me 2 different building interiors from 2 different chapters in the game, I would never be able to tell you which is which. It lulls you to sleep after a while because you know the game isn't really going to surprise you with any improvements down the line. By the end, I was seriously questioning if the art style was a benefit or a hindrance to the bigger picture, and at this point, I'm still not entirely sure. Something else I'm not entirely sure about is what the hell is going on with this plot. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad story, it's just really predictable. You play as a woman named Faith, who operates as a runner, and she's responsible for transporting information the authorities would prefer stayed secret. When Faith's sister Kate gets implicated in the murder of a well-known politician, Faith has to find a way to clear her name. Along the way, she gets help from Merc, her super smart tech guy who spends at least 20 hours a day monitoring police chatter, and a fellow runner named Celeste. Faith eventually stumbles upon something called Project Icarus, a plan to kill all the runners in the city to eliminate resistance to the oppressive regime. And surprise, surprise, Celeste is helping the people responsible. Remember when I said this story is predictable? Yeah, this is what I meant. I saw this betrayal coming from a mile away. Anyway, Kate is found guilty and gets hauled out to jail, but Faith takes out the van transporting Kate before it can reach the prison. But Kate ends up getting captured anyway after the police raid the runner's hideout, killing Merc in the process. Seriously, what was the point in saving Kate if she was just going to be captured again immediately afterward? Faith gives chase and eventually finds Kate again, only for Jackknife, that's this guy, to hold Kate at gunpoint and attempt to escape via helicopter. But Faith ain't having any of that shit, so she jumps into the helicopter, kicks Jackknife to his death, and saves Kate in one of the most unrealistic rescue sequences I've ever seen, even by video game standards. And then they all lived happily ever after, or some shit. There's a lot of story details I'm not going to bother covering here, since at the core it's not much more than a my family member was framed and I need to find the real killer story, which is a cliche that's been done a million times over. I will say though, I love the presentation of the story. The cutscenes are 2D, but they provide a nice flow to the story, and while the character movements are a little stiff sometimes, it feels like a good design choice that was actually thought out as opposed to a lazy, cheap alternative to 3D cutscenes, unlike some other games I've played. But that alone can't really save the story. It's not an exceptional narrative by any stretch, but surely the gameplay is, right? Right? Unfortunately, no. No, it's not. This may be a hot take, but I could never really get immersed in the gameplay here. Mirror's Edge features a series of linear levels in which you run, jump, climb, and fight your way to the next objective. The key component is runner vision. The game is played from a first-person perspective, and runner vision outlines objects you can interact with in red. This is good for helping you navigate, but it often leads to you turning your brain off and looking for wherever the red objects are without really observing the environment around you. Despite having linear stages, Mirror's Edge doesn't have the best level design for two reasons. One, getting through a lot of these areas quickly requires you to know the layout of the area before you enter, which you won't when you first play the game. In other words, there's a lot of trial and error design going on here. Second, a lot of the interiors are super cramped and give you very little space to move around. This feels like a slap in the face because the game's biggest appeal is supposed to be its emphasis on big open areas where parkour reigns supreme, and small cramped interiors are literally the antithesis of free-flow parkour. You don't get to move through areas quickly, rather you just perform one slow action after another. At least, that's what you do if you don't want to die over 150 times like I did. I felt like I had no choice but to move at a snail's pace oftentimes because the game's level design was forcing me to do that. And this issue isn't helped by the unresponsive controls. You jump with the left bumper in this game on Xbox, and I cannot for the life of me understand why this decision was made. Why not leave jumping on the A button and move interactions to LB since that's what the A button is used for? In fact, why not just scrap the interactions as a whole, because most of them just entail basic actions like pushing a button to call an elevator or slowly turning a valve. These actions are slow as fuck and they break the flow of the gameplay like nothing else. Getting back to the point though, the controls are incredibly unresponsive. There were so many times I hit LB as Faith was approaching an object, but then she would just not do whatever action she was supposed to do, and I fell to my death. And it's even worse when you have to make multiple inputs in rapid succession, since that just increases the odds of the game screwing you over. And speaking of getting screwed over, can we talk about this game's combat for a moment? It's easily the worst part of the game, and by far the portion of the gameplay that caused me the most frustration. It's painfully bare bones. You can't even lock onto enemies when targeting them, so you're going to spend a lot of time just punching air, which is further exacerbated by Faith's terrible range. Faith does have the ability to slow down time to make it easier to counter enemies, but I swear it doesn't do much to help. Especially because enemies usually appear in large groups, meaning you have to hope the onslaught of bullets doesn't kill you while you're trying to disarm an enemy. I've seen people defend the shitty combat by saying you're not meant to fight enemies and that you're supposed to avoid combat as much as possible, so it makes sense for you to be handicapped in combat. And that is likely true, since the game itself tells you to avoid combat whenever possible. However, that's not an excuse for how terrible the combat itself actually feels. Why would you intentionally design a core element of your game to be frustrating? That makes no sense. I could get behind that perspective a little more if the game didn't actively force you into combat on multiple occasions. Take this area for example. You have to go underneath this door and the enemies immediately notice you the instant you come into the room. There is no way to avoid being noticed, meaning you have to either run like hell and hope you reach the exit before the enemies gun you down, or you have to take your chances and fight the enemies, which leads to all the problems I just mentioned. And this isn't the only occasion where the game forces you into a fight with overwhelming odds. There was one word that kept coming into my mind every single time I enter combat, and that's clunky. Everything feels so clunky. The attacks, the disarming of enemies, even the gunplay, which feels like a last-second inclusion rather than something that was included during the ground up in development. The aiming is finicky, and there's no ammo counter, so you can't keep track of how many bullets you have left in order to plan out gunfights accordingly. I loathed fighting enemies in this game. It's absolutely brutal. Mirror's Edge is a pretty well-liked game, at least according to the information I've seen, but it never quite hit the sweet spot for me. The story's unambitious, the art style is a mixed bag, the controls are unresponsive, and the combat is a fucking nightmare. With all these grievances in mind, I can't possibly say Mirror's Edge is a good game. The game I played seems like it should have been the beta version of Mirror's Edge rather than the finished product. I think this game needed another year or so in the oven, because I do believe it had the potential to be something much better. But as it stands, there's a lot of half-baked ideas floating around. Mirror's Edge gets a 6 out of 10 from me. I can see the appeal of this, but it didn't impress me at all. If you do decide to pick this game up, I recommend approaching with cautious optimism. Hey everyone, if you made it this far, that means you watched the video all the way to the end. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you giving my video a chance, and I hope you have an amazing day. If you liked the video, consider hitting the like button or subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thanks again for watching, and go out and make today a special one. See you next time.